All right, welcome aboard, friends. Thank you for joining us here. It is episode 7 of the Rob Breakenridge Show. You can subscribe at our Substack page, robbreakenridge.ca, which is where this podcast is hosted. You can also listen and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and other podcast platforms. You can also find more content on our YouTube channel. A lot to get to on this episode of the podcast. We'll hear today from Dr. Michael Geist, Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law at the University of Ottawa. We'll talk about some of the concerns around Bill C-2, the Strong Borders Act, but concerns about certain provisions in the bill that really don't have much to do with border security, powers that are often referred to as lawful access. We'll talk about that on the program. Also today, a new book is challenging some of the narratives around vaping and making the case for vaping as a harm reduction tool. Dr. Mark Tyndall is professor of medicine at the School of Population and Public Health at UBC, and he is the author of a new book. It's called Vaping, Behind the Smoke and Fears. We'll hear from him today. Plus, Albertans will be heading to the polls this fall, voting in municipal elections. In Calgary, Jeromy Farkas back for a second shot at the mayor's chair and what'll be a rematch of 4 years ago. Farkas was the Ward 11 councillor from 2017 to 2021 and ran in that mayoral race 4 years ago, finishing second to Jody Gondek. He'll join us coming up later today. So all that and more straight ahead on this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. But first, let's get to some of the news out of the nation's capital, where there's been a couple of big announcements in recent days from Prime Minister Mark Carney. The announcement on Monday concerns Canada's defense spending, and a pretty big announcement that Canada is going to get to that 2% target this year, well ahead of what was originally planned. Now, the 2% target, of course, is what we've committed to as a member of NATO, to spend 2% of GDP on national defense. That's what all NATO members have agreed to. Not all have reached that target, although many have. Canada is unfortunately not one of those countries that has. So the announcement from the Prime Minister on Monday is that we are going to invest that money and get us to the target this year. Now, that's a substantial turnaround. It is long overdue, and it's certainly a positive that we're going in this direction. But I think the devil will be in the details here in terms of how doable this is. I mean, there's the question, where's the money going to come from? But there's also the question, can we spend it in a year? Where's that money going to go? Now, the other tricky thing for Canada, I think, is as we're scrambling to get to 2%, the conversation around some NATO countries is moving beyond that. And what might the next target be? So we're talking 3.5% or even 5% of GDP. So Canada may yet still have some catching up to do, even though we're finally getting to that 2% target. And it's not just about our NATO allies and what they expect of us or what NATO members expect of each other. It's also, I think, what Canadians expect or should expect when it comes to our ability to defend our own borders, defend our own country, our own sovereignty, and making sure that we have a competent, capable military that has what it needs, where the members that step up and volunteer, where they're taken care of. So again, I think this is a positive announcement. We'll have to see how all of this is going to look in practice. But this was Prime Minister Mark Carney on Monday making the announcement.
Today, Canada's new government is tabling what's called supplementary estimates. They include our plan to rebuild, rearm, and reinvest in the Canadian Armed Forces. The additional $9.3 billion for this fiscal year, 2025-2026, will bring Canada in line with the 2% NATO target this year, half a decade ahead of the previous government's plan. Right now, Canadian Armed Forces members are fighting forest fires to protect their fellow Canadians and communities. In fact, members from here are in Sandy Lake as we speak. They're defending our coasts and waters. They are patrolling the Arctic and supporting our allies on Russia's frontiers. They do so in tough conditions, and too often, has to be said, they do so with inadequate equipment. They deserve better, and they will have better. Members of our armed forces will get a well-deserved salary increase, which will contribute to better recruitment and retention of personnel. We will modernize, streamline, and enhance the benefit system so that veterans and their families can get the support they need sooner and more easily. We will importantly invest in military equipment infrastructure, and technology by procuring new aircraft, armed vehicles, drones, and ammunition, as well as new sensors to monitor the seafloor and the Arctic. We will repair and maintain existing ships, aircraft, infrastructure, and other assets that for far too long have been allowed to degrade.
Okay, so some of that is pretty doable in the short term. I mean, the idea of a salary increase for members of the Canadian Forces, that's pretty easy. And you can do that right away, and that's going to count toward defense spending. But other things are going to be a little more tricky. So we'll await further details. And then, of course, there was the question of where is all of this money going to come from? I mean, governments are going to have to figure this out. This needs to be a priority. And so not being sure where the money's going to come from shouldn't be an excuse for years more of inaction. We need to address this. But governments do need to figure out how to pay for all of this. And so when that question was put to Mark Carney on Monday, the answer wasn't immediately clear.
Today's announcement and this focus on meeting our own responsibilities to protect Canadians, but also our NATO obligations at the same time. This decision that we're announcing today and the associated summit at NATO towards the end of this month, those are significant events from a budget perspective, and we wanted to get to a point where we had addressed those. And then secondly, as you just referenced, we have just begun the process to look for savings in government, to improve government productivity, to reallocate spending across government. We're just, last point, and so getting greater traction on that and clarity on the scale of that will be important for the budget. Budget will be delivered in the early fall. The Minister of Finance will be more precise in due course. But we just cut taxes. We're not raising taxes. We just cut taxes. 22 million Canadians are getting a tax cut July 1st. Very pleased to see all-party support of that in the House. A good sign of parliamentarians coming together to help Canadians during the affordability crisis.
Okay, so there you go. Prime Minister Mark Carney says they're not going to raise taxes in order to pay for this new defense spending, spending that is necessary, but money that is going to have to come from somewhere. So in reaction to this announcement, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, speaking with reporters Monday in Ottawa, says they're all in favor of additional defense spending. And they're prepared to support the government on this, but they want to know where this money is going to come from. They want to know how we're going to pay for it. And getting a budget tabled sooner would be one way of addressing all of that.
Conservatives support rebuilding our military. After another lost decade of Liberal cuts, mismanagement, and back office bureaucracy, of boondoggles, and wasted money on bungled projects, our military has never been weaker. Now more than ever, we need a strong military that will reassert our sovereignty in the north, take back control of our Arctic waters. We need at least one, but probably two Arctic bases. We need fighter jets, Poseidon aircraft. We need 4 and not 2 icebreakers to bust up the ice and reassert that we are properly the ones that lay claim over our Arctic waters. We also need to fill the massive number of vacancies that have built up in our military after the last decade by increasing the dollars available to recruit and focusing the military on a warrior culture that actually inspires people to want to join again. All of this is going to take money, and that's why we support getting back to the 2% target as soon as possible. And we will support additional money for our military. That's why we're calling on the government to bring in a budget, because all of this will require a budget that not only puts this money forward, clearly identifies where it comes from, but cuts waste in bureaucracy, consultants, foreign aid, corporate welfare, and other areas so that the necessary increase in the military does not come as an inflationary burden on the backs of our Canadian taxpayers who've been suffering for far too long.
Okay, so that was Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre reacting to the Prime Minister's announcement about new defense spending and getting to our 2% NATO target. Now, the other big announcement came on Friday as Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled this new legislation, an act to enact the Free Trade and Labour Mobility in Canada Act and the Building Canada Act. This is about removing federal barriers to internal trade and accelerating the approval of what the Prime Minister refers to as nation-building projects. And so again, this is something that all could potentially be encouraging and positive. But what is it all going to mean in practice? Like, the optics are there. Is this just about the optics and creating the appearance that this is a government that believes in big, bold steps? Are we actually going to see some big, bold steps? What is going to get built here? So the idea is that if a project is deemed to be in the national interest, there will be a fast track or a faster track approval process to get those approved within 2 years. Now, that's not a guarantee. It's more of an aspiration or a target. But that would certainly represent a huge improvement when it comes to getting major projects approved and built. Now, there's also the question as to whether this would include pipelines. That's certainly the kind of project that we could use, certainly the kind of project that does add value to the Canadian economy, certainly a project that would be in the national interest, as the Prime Minister would define it. And certainly Mark Carney has indicated that he is open to new pipelines, which I guess is encouraging. But something we heard from him on Friday, and it actually also speaks to a bit of a controversy that one of his ministers got into, does raise some questions about that commitment. The federal government has authority when it comes to approving these kinds of projects, like a pipeline that would run across various provinces. And that was made crystal clear when BC tried to fight in court the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. BC claiming that they, as a province, had some jurisdiction. But it was pretty clear, as the courts ruled, that it is Ottawa's jurisdiction. So the federal government does have jurisdiction if there is objection from provinces, for example. But when the Prime Minister was asked about that on Friday, he seemed to indicate that he wouldn't impose a project on a province, or if a province objected to a project like a pipeline, that it would be, in his words, impossible to proceed with. I guess that's a choice, but he's certainly not constrained by that, as is pretty clear in the Constitution and as the courts have said. But this was what Mark Carney said on Friday. Now, there's some French and English in this answer, but I want to let you hear what he said in response to the question. This was the Prime Minister on Friday.
Oui, bonjour, M. Carney, Laurence Martin, Radio-Canada. Disons qu'il y a un projet de pipeline que vous estimez dans l'intérêt national, mais qu'il y a une province sur le chemin, le Québec, la Colombie-Britannique, qui n'en veut pas. Est-ce que vous allez l'imposer quand même?
Simplement, non. Il faut avoir un consensus.
De toutes les provinces?
De toutes les provinces, et les peuples, avec les peuples autochtones. Alors, il y a plusieurs projets à l'intérêt national et il y aura un processus afin d'établir un consensus pour quelques-uns. Parce que le projet, il faut possible de mettre en œuvre le processus, de bâtir le projet. Et si une province ne veut pas, c'est impossible. C'est pas le choix du gouvernement fédéral. I'll simplify. We will not impose a project on a province. We need consensus behind these projects, and we need the participation of Indigenous peoples. I'm going to add something. I'll translate it in French, which is what's encouraging from the First Minister's meeting in Saskatchewan is that many provinces came together in support of projects that would stretch across provincial boundaries. So, for example, the Western and Arctic Corridor would be an example, or the Energy East Partnership. That's Energy East Partnership, not pipeline, to be clear. And that's an example where that consensus is forming, understanding that we need to work together in order for this to happen. Much more, of course, needs to be done.
Okay, so what does all that mean? I understand. I mean, the Prime Minister would certainly prefer to have consensus when it comes to moving ahead with big projects. You know, these optics that he's created where everybody's working together and it's Team Canada. We saw that with the First Minister's meeting. Everyone seems excited and on the same page. Sure, it would be nice if you could have that and continue that. But it is also possible that certain projects might prove to be contentious. But leadership is about, if you believe it's necessary, you make it happen. And that might have to mean some tough decisions. So I get that Carney would prefer to avoid any kind of acrimony. But the idea that he would forsake federal jurisdiction in the face of some opposition is troubling. On Monday, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre was asked about that and said if we're just going to wait around to get everybody to agree, that nothing's ever going to happen.
There needs to be consensus to go forward with these big nation-building projects.
No, we've got to get it done. We need a pipe. At the end of the day, if you wait till everybody agrees on everything, nothing will happen. You're never going to get everybody to agree on every single project. And bottom line is we're giving 90% of our oil and 100% of our gas to the Americans at enormous price discounts. This is costing us tens of billions of dollars every single year to the exclusive benefit of American refineries and commodity traders who are able to take our product, bid up the price by $15 and sell it on the world stage, and do that literally about 1 billion times a year. And that is insane. So we can't wait any longer. We have to get things done, and it's going to take some backbone. And so we as Conservatives believe in pushing ahead with pipelines, and the shortest route is to the Pacific. Any other route is going to be even harder politically and physically. So we need a pipeline to the Pacific, and if the Prime Minister says he's going to wait till everyone agrees, then nothing will get done, which is what has been happening for the last decade.
Okay, so there's some reaction from Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. And again, sure, yeah, I mean, consensus is nice if you can get it. But what do you do if you don't? And if that holds us back from building what we need to build, that would be unfortunate. But yes, let's work to build that consensus. And if Mark Carney believes he's a prime minister that can do that, then expend that political capital. Let's make it happen. Now, the other related issue that came up to all of this involves Sean Fraser, who's now the federal justice minister. He ended up issuing an apology last week for some comments he made regarding these kinds of projects like pipelines, but where First Nations fit into all of this. Now, there is a duty to consult, and the courts have made that pretty clear. And we saw that with getting the Trans Mountain Pipeline over the finish line to make sure that all of that was done the right way. But as the courts have made clear, the duty to consult does not give First Nations a veto over individual projects. And so I think Sean Fraser, when he was asked about this, basically stated that as a fact, that there is no veto that exists. But then when he said that, and that got some reaction, Sean Fraser then apologized for the comments, saying that it created the impression that the government wanted to work unilaterally and not in partnership with Indigenous people. And again, okay, fair enough. I think the government should want to work in partnership with Indigenous communities when it comes to these projects. I think we've learned with some projects in recent years how important that can be with Trans Mountain or the Coastal GasLink Pipeline, LNG Canada, some other LNG projects in BC that have substantial First Nations involvement. There's some great potential there when it comes to those sorts of partnerships in building these projects and moving them forward. So absolutely work to build the consensus on that side as well. But it's not wrong to say that there's no veto that exists. Provinces don't have a veto. First Nations don't have a veto. The federal government should try to work with provinces, work with First Nations to do all of this. But the federal government still has that jurisdiction and authority that it should be prepared to use if necessary. So all of that to say, I think maybe there is some confusion about how the federal government intends on approaching all of this. And I think there's that concern that confusion is going to lead to inaction. And are we actually going to see any movement when it comes to a possible new pipeline project? One that is certainly going to be necessary, one that would fit in with this vision that the Prime Minister has outlined about major new projects that would be in the national interest. So I guess we'll see how this all plays out. All right, look, we got a lot to get to on this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Coming up in a moment here, we're going to hear from University of Ottawa law professor Michael Geist. We're going to talk about this new border security bill, Bill C-2, and some aspects of this bill that don't really seem to have anything to do with border security. Is the government trying to sneak in what's known as lawful access into this border bill? What does it mean for internet users and internet data in this country? We'll find out more about that in a few minutes. My name is Rob Breakenridge. Thanks for joining us here on the Rob Breakenridge Show. Well, Bill C-2, the Strong Borders Act, has now been tabled in the House of Commons, aimed at demonstrating that Canada is doing its part when it comes to drugs and irregular migration at the Canada-U.S. border. However, concerns have been raised for various aspects of this bill that would seem to have very little to do with border security, what's often referred to as lawful access. As our next guest describes it, these mark the latest attempts in a long-standing campaign for lawful access legislation. Dr. Michael Geist is a law professor and Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law at the University of Ottawa. His website is michaelgeist.ca. Professor Geist, great to have you with us here today. Welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
So let's talk about, first of all, when we speak of lawful access, information to internet subscribers, data that service providers hold, what does this all encompass, first of all?
Right. So this is a very long debate. We're talking about 20 plus years in terms of public policy debate in Canada. And at its heart, it speaks to the question of under what circumstances can law enforcement, and that's broadly defined, it's many type of law enforcement, obtain lawful access, legal access to oftentimes the data that's controlled by telecom companies, internet companies, increasingly some of the internet platforms themselves.
Because it's not as though there aren't circumstances where that information can't be accessed. What we're talking about, I guess, is making this a lot easier, really lowering the bar to access this information.
Right. It's a combination of, what can be accessed, and then even more, what is required of law enforcement before they're able to access it. And so you get, on the one hand, law enforcement that for a long time has been seeking access to at least some of this information without court oversight, without a warrant. And you have at the other end of the spectrum, certain kinds of information that providers certainly have said, we're not willing to disclose this information unless it's been first authorized by a court.
So we've seen various attempts over the years at bringing in these kinds of provisions. And I mean, technology has changed certainly over the years, but when we see what's in Bill C-2, is it very similar to what we've seen before? Or maybe how might it be different?
Yeah, there's been a slight evolution, but I think it's worth emphasizing that this issue was largely dead for at least the last decade, I would say. And the reason for that is that while we did go through several bills that were introduced back in the 2000s and early 2010s, that largely came to an end in 2014 when the Supreme Court of Canada examined essentially this issue in a case called Spencer and came to the conclusion that Canadians had a reasonable expectation of privacy when it came even to basic subscriber information. And so just to wind back the clock a little bit, law enforcement said, listen, we recognize that if we're talking about the content of a message or content involving some of the communications, we understand that you might want to have a court authorize that. But they argued that there was basic subscriber information, which often was characterized as phone book information, the sort of thing you might find in what used to be a phone book, that should be accessible without any of that court oversight. The Supreme Court of Canada effectively disagreed, saying, no, there are real privacy implications with that data too. And with that decision, it was pretty clear the providers simply weren't going to provide access to that information without court oversight. And the issue kind of went away. In fact, if anything, the Supreme Court of Canada just last year re-emphasized the issue and extended the privacy protection, saying that even IP addresses were also subject to a reasonable expectation of privacy. And yet here, as you mentioned in Bill C-2, a bill ostensibly about a border, the government has, at the very end, buried provisions that bring this debate right back again and envision granting law enforcement access in some circumstances to information about internet subscribers without a warrant.
So the thing, I mean, if the government needed to argue or wanted to argue that they need these powers and they need to make these changes, and here's why, I mean, I guess we could have that debate, but is there a basis for including it in C2? Is there any kind of connection between these powers and the issue of border security?
No, there simply isn't. I mean, it's hard to even go through the conjecture that they've raised with a straight face. So, in years past, as I mentioned, this is going back now many, many years, we've seen the government raise things like this is about protecting children, this is about dealing with organized crime or terrorism, and we see the same kinds of rationale raised now. We've actually seen them talk. It's about the kids. It's about organized crime. It's about fentanyl now. It quite clearly, when we're talking about the ability to give law enforcement the ability to obtain location data, where someone was and when they were accessing a service without court oversight, that's got nothing to do with those issues. That's simply looking at the wish list that law enforcement has had. It was up on a shelf for a very long period of time, and someone decided it was a good idea to insert it at the very end of a very long bill that has really nothing to do with any of those issues.
So is there room to fix this? I mean, it seems the obvious solution then would be to remove this, table it separately if the government believes it's necessary. But do you see any value in trying to amend or change this bill as it is?
Well, I mean, I think as a starting point, as you rightly say, this is really has little to do with the core of the border bill, and so it really should be. It's an important enough bill that it really should be debated on its own. In fact, if we go back in history when these bills were introduced, they were often part of sort of criminal reform and things like that. And even then, there were arguments that the government had overreached by incorporating it into other issues. For example, more than 10 years ago, they included it in a cyberbullying bill and argued this was needed to address cyberbullying. But in this instance, it quite clearly needs to be on its own. As for whether it is fixable, even if it was on its own, I think there are going to be significant concerns in large measure because so long as law enforcement, now aided by the government, insists that there should be access to this kind of information without court oversight, I think we're going to run into issues both in terms of the views of certainly the privacy community, civil liberties community, but I think, quite frankly, the view of the courts. And they've been pretty clear. They're relying on the Charter of Rights and what is viewed as an unlawful search and seizure, in effect, in trying to access this information. And, I recognize why law enforcement might want to gain access to this and things to be a bit easier. But it seemed to me that the better approach is to carve out or establish a particular kind of warrant with this kind of information in mind so that it would remain consistent with some sort of court oversight. And the desire to access this information without it, I think, is troubling. It is worth emphasizing that when we had a system in place that allowed for this kind of access, it was used at an astonishing rate. And so I think back to some of the access to information requests going back into the 2000s and early 2010s. And it turned out that providers were facing more than 1 million requests per year about subscriber information. Literally, a request every about 30 seconds was coming into a provider for this kind of information. And so if you open the door to gaining this sort of access, it will have implications for millions of Canadians.
I want to take a step back and speak more broadly about digital policy. I don't know if this, gives us an indication of where the government's going, but there's some big issues carrying over from, I guess, what we would call the previous Liberal government here, the Online News Act, the Online Streaming Act, big centerpiece digital policies that seem a little bit up in the air right now. What's your understanding or your read on where we're at on some of this?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And, we've got certain pieces of legislation or policies that did pass. So the Online Streaming Act, the Online News Act are both law. They are both now at different stages at the CRTC or in the courts. In the case of the Streaming Act, there's an appeal that's currently up at the Federal Court of Appeal over an early CRTC decision, and they've also been conducting some further hearings seeking to implement that bill that envisions requiring platforms to make contributions in support of the creation of Canadian content, as well as what the definition of Canadian content ought to be. In the case of the news bill, it's the law. Google's been paying some money, your listeners may recall, as part of their compliance with the legislation. Facebook and Instagram, the Meta company, the Meta platforms, those have been blocking access to news now for just about 2 years in Canada, and there doesn't seem to be any change of that in sight. There were, however, a whole series of other bills that didn't make it over the finish line. So that would include privacy and artificial intelligence and online harms. And it's a great question as to where those things are. It's hard to know exactly what the priorities will be, although I would say that the early indications aren't great. I mean, we've just been talking about the inclusion of lawful access in Bill C2. 2 days later, in another bill, in Bill C4, the government brought back more what really are anti-privacy provisions, in this case exempting political parties from privacy laws for the data that they collect, in a bill that's ostensibly about affordability measures. So we've seen literally in the very first week of substantive new legislation being proposed, the government twice burying sets of laws or proposals that really undermine Canadian privacy rights. So that makes it a bit hard to be optimistic when we start thinking about, well, will they bring back solid, strong privacy reform as we saw in C27? What will they do on AI, although they now have appointed an AI minister? What's going to happen with respect to online harms? The early feedback based on government's actions just literally in its first few days in the new House of Commons certainly aren't great.
And Michael, just stepping away from digital policy, and I mean, I'm asking you this on the day where we learned that the Holocaust Memorial in Ottawa was vandalized, very, very disturbing, but it's a troubling trend. And I know you've been outspoken, and it's unfortunate maybe there aren't more outspoken voices about what we've been seeing on campuses in Canada when it comes to anti-Semitism. Just your thoughts on where we're at and whether have we seen any progress on this issue?
It's a great and unfortunate question to ask, and you're right. It's been certainly post October 7th, 2023. Now more than a year and a half. The upsurge in anti-Semitism on our streets, at synagogues, schools, and certainly on university campuses has been incredibly disturbing and quite chilling, frankly, for the Jewish community, but I think even more broadly for our conceptions of what Canada is all about, and being accepting of different views and different backgrounds, even if we may disagree politically on certain issues. I think that in the last year, we have seen some movement from some universities in terms of trying to take some of these issues a bit more seriously, and recognizing some of the harm that anti-Semitism has caused on campus, a bit more openness to establishing more clearer codes and some amount of enforcement. But it's hard, I think, to arrive at a conclusion that we desperately still need more. And as you mentioned, we still see incidents, the defacement of the Holocaust Memorial here, the literal shootings in the United States in the last number of weeks in both Colorado and Washington, which highlights that anti-Semitism, there were attempts to say that, well, this is just people that are exaggerating or seeking to weaponize anti-Semitism. It's very, very clear at this point in time that the Jewish community that was speaking out on this, and those that were allies that did as well, that these were very real issues, that the risks were real, and that the failure to act, and the failure at times of some of our political leaders to unequivocally state that this is wrong and then take action to deal with incidents when it actually happens, has only had the effect, I think, of enabling even more of it.
Yeah, I mean, so your sense of what's happening on campus is a reflection then of what's happening more broadly in society?
Yeah, no, I think we do see that we see some of the things that we see on campus spills out elsewhere. Yeah. We're not in the proverbial bubble when it comes in this context, and so I think there is still more work to be done. I think there are institutions that have made really legit efforts to try to deal with it. We've seen anti-Semitism coordinators and advisors appointed in some places. We've seen some policies adopted in some places to provide even stronger clarity about what constitutes anti-Semitism, oftentimes looking to the IRA definition or understanding about what some of these implications would be. But the stories, the incidents, I think, still persist. And when you talk to students, we literally just had our convocation at our own law school just yesterday, and talking to some of the students just graduating, they were appreciative of the 3 years, but there's no doubt that their experience was deeply colored by some of the incidents that took place on campus over the last couple of years.
No doubt. Well, we'll leave it there for now. Michael, appreciate your perspective and insight on all of this. Much more is mentioned. Michael Geist, Dotsier. Professor Geist, thanks again for joining us here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, that was Dr. Michael Geist. He's a law professor at the University of Ottawa, where he is also Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law. You can read more from him at his website, michaelgeist.ca. Coming up next on the Rob Breakenridge Show, an interesting new book on vaping, making the argument that our policy focus really needs to be getting people off of cigarettes, convincing people to stop smoking, and that we should be taking a harm reduction approach to doing so. And that's where he says vaping fits in. Dr. Mark Tyndall from UBC has a new book. It's called Vaping Behind the Smoke and Fears. We'll hear from him right around the corner. You're listening to the Rob Breakenridge Show. Vaping remains a topic of controversy in this country, with governments increasingly taking a regulatory approach that limits access to e-cigarettes and other vaping products, the argument being that nicotine is addictive and that vaping is possibly harmful. However, a new book is challenging some of those narratives and instead makes the case for vaping as a harm reduction tool, arguing that it offers smokers an alternative that is much less harmful than cigarettes. Dr. Mark Tyndall is professor of medicine at the School of Population and Public Health, UBC, former executive director of the BC Centre for Disease Control, and former deputy provincial health officer in BC. His new book is called Vaping Behind the Smoke and Fears. drmarktyndall.com is his website. Dr. Tyndall, great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Okay. Thanks, Rob.
Let's talk about what prompted you to write this book. Why is this needed right now?
Well, I've been involved in harm reduction for most of my career, and that includes more what people classically think is a harder drug, so heroin and crystal meth and cocaine and those kind of things. So I've really worked in harm reduction in action for 25 years, and when I heard about vaping back in 2012, this seemed like the classic example of a harm reduction intervention or a technology where people could still inhale nicotine without all the poisons involved in cigarettes. So I've sort of been at this for 10 or 12 years now, and finally decided to write a book about it.
We'll talk about how we got to the point then where vaping is viewed almost more of a public health menace as opposed to a public health tool. How did that narrative emerge?
Well, that's a great question, and that's what I try to explore in the book. I mean, people don't like smoking in society, so we've had 30 or 40 years of quite a social experiment of shaming people who smoke, and unfortunately, when this new technology came along, it was called e-cigarettes. So it's really nothing to do with a cigarette. There's no combustion. There's no tobacco. It's just allowing people to have nicotine. And it was kind of by public health and the media kind of just melded in with smoking. And it's just another form of smoking. And we don't want people to do this. So it was right from the beginning, it was off to a bad start as far as people's perception of what vaping was. And few people started really ask the question, well, is it a lot safer? And clearly right from the beginning, we knew that most of the toxins that cause disease were not even available in vaping. So it wasn't even plausible that it could cause lung cancer, but somehow we've developed a story that it must be just as bad as smoking because it looks like smoking.
It's interesting. We see it probably in other aspects of harm reduction where, I think some people see it as less than ideal. We want the perfect solution. It's almost like we'd prefer abstinence, especially when it comes to smoking and nicotine, and harm reduction. In this case, a less harmful product is not that almost moralistic or perfect solution. Are we letting perfect be the enemy of the good here?
Oh, for sure. There's this idea that, if we just keep going with our current interventions, that smoking will become history. And although in Canada particularly, we've seen quite dramatic reduction in smoking, it's really been quite stagnant for the past decade or so, except for people who have turned to vaping, which has an impact on smoking. But it's also become a social social equity issue. So it's not across the board that everybody smokes. So it's really focused on people who are more marginalized and people in lower socioeconomic terms, and they don't seem to have much of a voice in this. If the 20% wealthiest people in Canada were all dying of cigarettes, and they had a safer way to get their nicotine, I'm sure we'd be jumping all over it. But it's because it's such a marginalized activity these days that we just tell people, well, either quit or you die. And even though we have a really good solution for them with vaping and other safer nicotine products.
Seems like almost an odd question to ask in the year 2025, but what makes smoking cigarettes so deadly, so dangerous?
Well, it's all to do with combustion, so it's nothing to do with nicotine. So people are dependent on nicotine, and they find it very helpful to them, and find it very difficult to give it up. And it is a very addictive substance, and but it's really when you burn the leaves that all these deadly chemicals are released. And without that combustion, most of those chemicals are no longer a peril to you. And so, but we know right down to the molecular level what causes lung cancer, what causes cardiovascular disease, what causes stroke. And basically, cigarettes in medicine are associated with almost every chronic disease we know, some directly causative like lung cancer, and some diseases are almost all diseases are made worse by people who smoke. So we really know it's the combustion that causes the chemicals to be released, and that can be deadly for people.
So it's clear that if every smoker switched to vaping, that would represent a tremendous public health benefit. Is that to any extent then offset by non-smokers taking up vaping? How do we view it from that side?
Well, yeah, public health and media focused almost exclusively on teen vaping. So, and clearly there's kids that would never smoke or have never smoked that are vaping. And this really took on a life of its own. And we know that young people experiment with things, and whether it's alcohol or cannabis or unsafe sex or things that we're, in society we're quite concerned about, and we try to warn kids about the risks of this. And vaping is just another thing that happened. In Canada, it really peaked around 2018. And since then, the fad has kind of gone away. Still, kids do vape, but very few end up being chronically dependent on nicotine, and very few turn to smoking. So this was the big concern, that we'd get kids that were become dependent on nicotine, and then they'd turn to cigarettes, and that just hasn't happened. Smoking rates among kids are at all historic lows in Canada. Less than 1% of high school kids smoke cigarettes. So it's really gone away, which is a great public health success story. And many of the kids who are vaping now would be the same kids who would be smoking cigarettes. So in some ways, that's way better than them using cigarettes. Yeah, it's remarkable how that's happened. And clearly, I've had teenage kids. I have a 12-year-old now. I mean, I wouldn't encourage him to come home with a vape, but I know that likely he'll try it. And kids just have to know the truth. And the way the campaigns have gone with really outlandish claims about health risks from nicotine is the scare tactics for kids just hasn't really worked. They never work like that. And we just need to be honest with kids that you probably don't want to get addicted to nicotine, that we don't, any psychoactive substances, we don't, we don't support them in young people, just like cannabis and alcohol and all these other things. But it will happen, and it's certainly no reason to ban these for all the smokers who could really benefit from from vaping.
Yeah, and I mean, just building up what you said, I mean, it is remarkable how you think back even a quarter of a century ago, around the turn of the century, late 90s, early 2000s. I mean, you had 25, 30% of teens who were smokers. I remember what it was like, when I was in high school and my peers, it was quite common. It's almost unheard of now. So it is interesting too, because this idea of a gateway effect, that vaping is going to lead to smoking, there's really zero evidence of that, isn't there?
Zero evidence. I mean, we have perfect evidence that it hasn't happened. So we've done the natural experiment. So really vaping became more popular in kind of 2016 to 2018. And you would expect if it was a gateway that already we'd be seeing more young people smoking cigarettes, and that just hasn't happened. So we basically disproved the gateway thing, and which is great. So and nicotine for people who cannot get off it, and that's most smokers. So 80 to 90% of people who are currently smoking cigarettes will say they want to stop smoking cigarettes, but the draw of nicotine is just too great for them. And to me, it's kind of crazy then punishing them and saying, well, okay, you're going to die from this, when we could easily say, well, here's something that's going to be way better for you, and you can still have nicotine, and you can take time to, maybe if you want to get off nicotine eventually, great. And the other big advantage of vaping is you can dial down your nicotine. So It's like cigarettes, it's really hard. You can try and smoke less cigarettes, but you can't really control how hard you puff on it and how much nicotine you're getting. But for vaping, you can actually dial it right down, and you can wean yourself off nicotine if that's what your intention is.
Well, is it partly the act of vaping that makes it effective? Because I think critics say, well, there are other tools. There's nicotine gum. There's even now, nicotine pouches, these kinds of products. Right. But what is it about vaping that makes it, in your view, an effective anti-smoking tool?
Yeah, well, like any harm reduction, we want to meet people where they're at. And right now, the kind of the pattern people are in, the kind of hand to mouth thing, the social part of smoking is you can do exactly the same thing with vaping. So I think that vaping is much closer to cigarette smoking than putting on a patch, for instance. And but I think all these other nicotine delivery systems can be very effective for people. But we know that patches especially are not that effective. So they're better than cold turkey, and people do have relied on using patches, but it's designed to have a very slow release of a steady state of nicotine. And that's not what people are usually desiring, which is more of a hit of nicotine when people take a cigarette, and then it dies off, and then they get another bump. And so vaping can supply that same sort of pattern of use. The pouch is probably much more effective than the patch because it's more direct, and you get more of an instant shot of nicotine from that. So I think pouches are also very very useful and important, but they're a step back from actually inhaling it like people do with cigarettes.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to vaping itself, I mean, less harmful, or in the case, I guess, compared to cigarettes, much less harmful, but that doesn't mean completely without harm. What do we know about what's being inhaled when it comes to vaping, possible health risks? I know critics say maybe they haven't been around long enough for us to really know for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable question. I mean, cigarettes have been around for over a century, and vaping's been around 10 or 15 years. But in those 10 or 15 years, we really haven't seen any signal of any lung disease that's coming from people who are vaping. So I think it's important to continue to watch for that. Breathing fresh forest air is better than vaping, putting in vape into your lungs. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But the risk compared to cigarettes is just so infinitely less. It makes no sense to continue with cigarettes. And so for people who want nicotine, though, or getting used to nicotine and have never smoked, I think there is it's not a zero risk, but it's just so much less. And if somebody asks me, what if I vape for 20 years, what's going to happen to my lungs? Right. I can say that I can't tell you for sure, but so far we haven't really noticed any changes. And people who have never smoked and vaped people have had their spirometry followed and their exercise capacity, and really there's been no no change. And so it remains to be seen, but I really can tell people that based on the chemicals that you're exposing yourself to, I don't have any major concerns that this is going to come back and bite you in the long term.
So what does a smarter regulatory approach look like? Because we see governments making vaping products harder to get, making them more expensive. Now we're seeing a push to ban flavored products, balancing harm reduction and limiting access to minors. What does that need to look like, do you think?
Well, I think regulation is important. So we want quality products. So there's been a lot of focus on kind of bizarre products coming in that you can find vape products that are unregulated that do release heavy metals and different things. So we need to make sure that what we're selling to people are high quality and don't contain these other contaminants, that the e-liquids contain what they say they contain and don't contain extra additives and things. So all that is part of the regulatory process. But at the base, we have to make sure that vaping is much more accessible and cheaper than cigarettes. So right now we have the taxes on vaping products are higher than cigarettes. And so we need to incentivize people who are buying cigarettes to change. And that can come easily with regulations, making them very cheap or cheaper and reducing the taxes on them and making them more available. So just clumping them in with cigarettes and putting them behind closed doors and things doesn't make any sense to me. And they should always be more available and accessible and attractive than cigarettes. And I think if we, as a public health strategy, I think in a couple of years, we could basically change all smokers into vapors if we made them cheap and accessible over cigarettes. And we get rid of cigarettes would be a huge thing. The other thing is flavors, and that's, again, focused on kids and that we don't want to have attractive flavors for children. And again, the media often focuses on kind of bizarro flavors like gummy bears and strawberry shortcake. These are not popular at all. I guess they're available. They have been sold, but what kids like flavors, just like adults like flavors. But the most popular ones are fruit flavors and mint and things like that. And the vaping is synonymous with flavors. So banning flavors is like banning vaping. So if 85% of people vaping are using flavors, they're not going to all just jump onto tobacco flavored vape. And the bizarre thing about that too is people are trying to get away from cigarettes. So having the only available vape tobacco flavor is so counterintuitive. It makes absolutely no sense to me. So we need to hold on to flavors to make them attractive to people and that people can enjoy it. And again, the moralistic part of things, I think many people, well, why should people enjoy vaping? Like, why shouldn't we make it like torturous for them and make it as least comfortable as possible? And I don't think so. If you're going to vape, you might as well have flavors that you enjoy and, make it a pleasurable experience for yourself.
So that involves convincing public officials, policymakers, but what about those in the field of public health? Your peers, your colleagues, is it also about convincing them?
Yeah, I mean, my book is directed at them. I mean, I'm fairly critical of the approach that many physicians have taken. For the life of me, I can't understand how a respirologist who basically their practice revolves around people who smoke cigarettes would not feel obligated to offer their patients a safer product. And that isn't happening. Or you go to an oncologist for your lung cancer and you smoke and they don't offer you vaping. I mean, to me, it's unethical and it's just not part of good medical practice where we should be trying to supply people with the best options for themselves. And so I think my medical colleagues have sort of followed basically the public health messaging. And for many people I talk to, my colleagues, they haven't really looked into it. They have the same level of knowledge about vaping as the general public do, and they get their information from media, and they when they think about it, it's pretty hard for them to push back on my arguments. But for many of them, they haven't really considered it. It must be bad. Looks like smoking. I don't want to recommend it to people. I don't, we haven't followed them for 30 years, so I'm not sure about it. Like, very vague and unscientific kind of responses that I get from people. And I really do think that maybe I can have a role to try to convince the people that harm reduction works, that getting rid of nicotine from our society is not ever going to happen, and that we need to offer people a safer alternative.
Indeed. Well, the book is out now. It's called Vaping, Behind the Smoke and Fears. Dr. Mark Tyndall, thanks again for your insight on all of this. Appreciate you joining us here today.
Thank you very much, Rob.
All right, once again, that's Dr. Mark Tyndall. He's a professor of medicine at the School of Population and Public Health, University of British Columbia, former executive director of the BC Centre for Disease Control, and also former deputy provincial health officer in BC. His new book, it's called Vaping, Behind the Smoke and Fears. Much more at drmarktyndall.com, Tyndall. Coming up after the break, we'll take a look in on the municipal election coming up this year in Calgary and the return to the political spotlight of Jeromy Farkas, former city councillor, former mayoral candidate, is back in the running for the top job this time around. We'll have a conversation with Jeromy Farkas coming up in a few moments here. You're listening to The Rob Breakenridge Show. Well, Albertans will head to the polls this fall, voting in municipal elections. In Calgary, Jeromy Farkas is back for a second run at the mayor's chair and will be a rematch of 4 years ago. Farkas, of course, was the Ward 11 city councillor from 2017 to 2021 and ran in the 2021 mayoral race, finishing second to Jody Gondek. He's had a busy 4 years in the interim. Joining us now to discuss the race, his decision to return to the political ring, is the aforementioned Jeromy Farkas. Jeromy.ca is the website. Jeromy, great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Rob.
It's interesting. I mean, we just had a federal election, we're going into the summer months, stampede, all of that. But still, I think there's some pressing issues that are certainly on the minds of Calgarians. What's your sense of how engaged or plugged in people are right now, first of all?
Well, I think when it comes to the major issues, things like safety, housing, affordability, jobs, the issues are present, right? So it's not necessarily about the next coming civic election. We got a couple months to go until that's done, but the issues are there all the same. And I think that the level of engagement is there. And as we've been going out speaking to Calgarians about the issues, what we've been hearing about is growth. So we're growing very fast as a city, and we need to keep up with that. Really means delivering safe streets, housing we can actually afford, and the jobs that are going to be needed to build a stronger city.
Yeah, and I think those have been pressing issues for the last few years. I mean, is part of this the fact that, that this mayor, this city council hasn't been able to deliver on some of those big issues? Why do they remain so front and center?
Well, I don't really want to knock any of the other candidates, but I'd say for me personally, I'm running for mayor because Calgary needs a leadership that's ready for the future so that we can meet the moment as far as safety, housing, jobs. And I think a lot of Calgarians have been telling us over the past several months that City Hall's stuck and we need somebody to be able to help get it moving again. And I think that that's really the focus. Over the course of the next decade, Calgary could grow by as much as 1 million more people. That means we need to be able to solve for services, infrastructure, everything that a growing city needs so that we don't just maintain quality of life, but we actually improve it in every single corner of the city so that this growth challenge becomes the opportunity to be able to improve quality of life, not just survive it.
Let's talk about your own journey sort of away from politics and back to it. So as mentioned, you served on city council, you ran for mayor, and then sort of stepped away from it all. And, the last 4 years have been interesting for you professionally, personally. How is Jeromy Farkas different now than say 4 years ago, or even, I guess, 8 years ago for that matter?
Well, I didn't so much step away as step up in different ways. And last time I came in ready to fight, and this time I'm coming in ready to build. I've gained a lot of experience as a nonprofit leader. I've learned some really hard lessons about leadership, but more so about how to bring people together. And I've really seen firsthand how policy can shape lives. And in this capacity, though, I think Calgarians are asking for leadership that will step up to solve problems. I've personally grown, or I know our city has changed, and I think it's time that our leadership did too.
Yeah. But still, I mean, for example, you're going to be running against Jyoti Gondek in this election. You served on council with her prior to the last election. So do you get the sense that maybe she has changed as well? Or how is this matchup, if you will, different than it was 4 years ago?
Well, I don't think this is so much a rematch as a completely new election. The city's different. The issues are different. The people are different. But I think what Calgarians are looking for is just that statesmanship. There's a lot of challenges on the horizon. How do we position, say, Calgary at the center of a strong and united Team Canada? I think that's going to be a major emergent issue over the next coming months. And it's also one of the first municipal elections that will be held with the advent of municipal political parties. And I think Calgarians are looking for that pragmatism, a leader who can make decisions without party or ideological interference. And really, Calgarians have been telling me that they want to know that their representative is working for them rather than the narrow interests of a political party. I know a lot of your listeners are very politically engaged, but I genuinely really believe at the municipal level, there's not so much a left or a right. There's only together. And that's why we need leadership that's willing to work with anyone from any background to be able to get things done for Calgarians.
Yeah. Well, yeah, these days it seems like everyone needs to, or feel a need to expect people to plant a political flag somewhere. Who are you? Where do you stand? But I guess what you're saying is that it's more about being pragmatic than ideological.
Well, it's focusing on the solutions, right? I think that the challenge of, say, that growth prerogative, how do we meet the moment? How do we potentially be, by the end of the next decade, a city of 3 million people? It's going to mean some difficult decisions around infrastructure. How do we pay for that? How do we provide for that? And I think that what we're seeing from this current mayor and council is that really they've become stuck. They've become fractured, reactive, and too often, I'd say, disconnected from everyday Calgarians. And look, just as an example, they found the money for $1 billion arena, but they struggle year to year to keep essential services online, things like the Inglewood Pool open, or even not being able to stop Vacova from closing its doors. So there's just a real question around priorities here. But most of all, though, I think Calgarians are looking for that statesmanship, an adult in the room to be able to really focus on that positive vision and how we meet the moment for that growth challenge in a way that just makes life better for all of us, not just Calgarians today, but also the new neighbors we'll welcome in the future.
Well, let's think about being the mayor, right? And where it differs from being a premier or a prime minister. Yes, you're sort of leading the municipal government, but you need to bring people with you. You need to be able to build consensus, or you're not going to get anything done.
Yeah, and that's what I'm hoping to be able to provide as Calgary's next mayor, and really to be able to receive what I didn't as a rookie councillor. I want to be able to provide that coaching, that mentorship. And when I think about my own experience as a nonprofit director, as a CEO, I used to think that leadership looked like being in the center of the lights, center of attention. Leadership actually looks like being the last guy to turn off the lights, to be stuck in the chairs at the end of the room, picking up the the broom after everyone's gone. And when I think about what I've been able to build, say, for example, with some of my experience with Big Brothers and Big Sisters, with the Alex, in my prior role with Glenbow Ranch, I've been able to work across party lines to be able to get things done. And I think that that's what Calgarians are looking for from this council. Less grandstanding, less division. And that's a key reason why I'm running as an independent. It's not so that I'd be alone, but instead so that I can actually build that team. I don't think councillors I don't think Calgarians are looking from their councillor for that ideological approach. They want representation that will just be practical, focused on the issues, and willing to potentially disagree on issues, but also work together when there might be other alignment.
I mean, you mentioned the arena deal, and I guess there are those kinds of decisions that maybe you would have objected to or taken a different approach on. But how much does City Council and the next mayor, and if that's you, need to sort of move forward, right? You look at, do certain things need to be revisited, or we just kind of move on to some of the other big challenges we're facing?
Well, my focus is squarely on the future. Of course, during an election, you need to be able to hold these candidates to account. Of course, I will talk about some of the failures of leadership. I will demonstrate a better path forward, and that's really what we've been doing through our policy briefs. We've been very unique amongst all of the campaigns. Instead of just identifying problems, actually put ideas and solutions in the window, give Calgarians something to vote for rather than something to vote against. So again, I'm not here to revisit those past decisions, but I think that on a go-forward basis, Calgarians are expecting a lot more focus on affordability, a lot more focus on safety, those core issues. And what we've seen from this council is just a lack of focus. And I think getting back to the focus on Calgarians at the center of that work is how we move forward on all these issues.
Yeah, you mentioned crime, and just a few days ago, you released your crime platform. And this is a big issue. It's not unique to Calgary, but it's one of those issues where I think, municipalities do have a significant role to play. How do you see City Council being able to more effectively address issues around crime and public safety?
I think in the past, there's been a lot of bickering, Rob, about jurisdiction, saying this is not my responsibility. But I think very clearly what we know from the evidence, the research, is that safety is a collective responsibility. It doesn't live with one single department or one level of government or one part of the community. And I grew up in Dover and East Calgary. I know what it means to feel unsafe, and I know we can do better. We can be tough on crime, and we can be even tougher on the root causes of crime, because that's what real safety looks like. So our plans that we're putting forward is about putting safety first. Of course, there's leading on immediate measures, things like reopening the downtown police station, targeting the repeat violent offenders. But critically, it's about investing in prevention. And it's not just the right thing to do in terms of safety and respecting the dignity of people, but it's also the right thing financially. I like to think of it in terms of a household. If the roof is broken, water's leaking in, how much money do you want to spend on buckets? You want to spend just enough to be able to deal with the issue, but also be able to prevent it in the long term. So I think that we got to be able to do both, be tough on crime, but also tougher on the root causes of crime.
Well, and it's one area where there's room for cooperation with the provincial government. There are a lot of issues where, that the relationship is important, but it is somewhat strained. So when you look at the importance of having open communication, good relations with the province, but also, standing up for Calgary at the same time when that's necessary, how do you need to approach that?
Well, I had to approach it with some of my more recent experience. For example, working as a wilderness first responder, as a nonprofit director and CEO. This came to head, for example, with a recent advocacy that we had around the proposed Glenbow Dam. So if listeners aren't familiar, Glenbow Ranch is a provincial park between Calgary and Cochrane. It was left donated to the people of Alberta. The government for a time was considering flooding and destroying that park as part of a flood mitigation protection measure for the city of Calgary. We, of course, stood up. We advocated to protect the park, but for us, it wasn't so much a fight, instead of trying to help the province find a different solution. And that's what we did. Rather than just oppose the project, we worked to be able to build that coalition. And that's how I brought together the grassroots and business leaders, progressives and conservatives, environmentalists and ranchers, not just to fight for the sake of fighting, but instead to be able to help find a different solution. And it was after a couple years that we worked with the province to be able to find an alternative that would be able to protect the park and Calgary. So that's the type of approach that we need. We need to stand up, be firm as far as our interests, but also to be able to find enough of a common ground so that both sides can get what they want.
You also talked about taxes and spending, and I think that's been part of your record or your reputation as kind of a fiscal hawk. And it's a tricky balance, I think, for municipal governments in trying to hold the line on taxes as much as possible, because that does speak to affordability, but being able to address some of the challenges, and especially growth challenges in a city like Calgary. Where do you find the balance there, do you think?
Well, it's very obvious we got to make every existing tax dollar work harder. So not to belabor the point, but it's decisions that are made during budgets that reflect our values. So, for example, again, with the arena deal, there's about $1 billion in cash that was available to that, but not, for example, for other key essential infrastructure. The amount of money saved to be able to fix Calgary's aging water infrastructure is about $1 billion. So how can we pay upfront cash for one of these projects, but the other we might have to borrow for the next 35 years. So in many ways, it's also about making the right types of investment. Say, for example, to revisit crime and public safety, we know that dealing with, say, homelessness in an emergency response way, in terms of, say, policing costs, emergency room visits, we know that this is extremely expensive. We know that the evidence and data has borne out that dealing with this in a preventative and proactive measure, it doesn't just save lives, it also saves money. So again, it's not so much, I believe that council has more than enough money and resources to be able to work with, especially if we can build greater relationships with the provincial and the federal counterparts. But we also have to make sure that we're spending the money in the right places so that long-term costs can be reduced. And just another example is recently we've learned that it's about a quarter of the water that's produced in the city of Calgary's water system is lost due to leakage, due to the aging nature of the infrastructure. So for example, if we're able to address that and actually fix our pipes, that wouldn't just solve for reliability, it would also make sure that rates would in the future would go down. And these are just a couple issues that, for example, I tried to raise as a member of City Council. Back in 2018, we knew that the water infrastructure was an issue. That's why, for example, Councillor Drew Farrell and I championed accelerated action, for example, to fix lead water pipes, even wooden water pipes in the city of Calgary. So it's a matter of having the right money in the right places to be able to reduce long-term costs.
Yeah. And I mean, the challenge too for Calgary, because you talk about the number of folks who are coming here. Calgary can't really control how many folks are coming to Alberta, for that matter, how many folks are coming to Canada. I mean, we've got tariffs, all the uncertainty that's well outside of our control. So what about dealing with external forces and things that are outside of municipal government's control? Because we are kind of at the mercy of a lot of outside circumstances on some big issues.
Yeah, we can't change the weather, but we can adjust our sails. And that's why I think our next mayor needs to be somebody who's practical, able to work with both a conservative premier and a liberal prime minister. And I think having that practicality is going to be key. And I just want to revisit that growth question. So my father came as a refugee, as a newcomer. He came willing and eager to contribute to building this country. I think that that's central. This growth opportunity that we're facing, it's incredible. I think that it can really serve to improve our quality of life. I think that this is a great thing, that we're continuing to be a beacon of talent and attracting investment and so on. But we have to be prepared. We need to be strategic and we need to have vision. Calgary's never really been proactive in terms of addressing these issues. We've always responded reactively to these growth pressures. And I know that for us to be able to be that city, then I know that we can be and that we need to be, it's going to have to come from being proactive on these issues.
Well, some important issues to be discussed in this campaign. Are we expecting, I would imagine at some point, some debates? What's your understanding of how things are going to unfold in the weeks and months ahead here?
Yeah, we're very much looking forward to continuing these conversations, and I think the event schedule is starting up. We've already put a couple challenges out to some of the other campaigns. For example, our campaign is unique in being the only municipal mayoral campaign to publish very close to real time our donors list. So up on our website, you can actually see who is contributing to our campaign as part of our regular disclosure. We're going to be continuing to put out similar challenges around transparency, around party platform, or rather platform commitments and so on. So just very excited to continue that conversation. But just to center again, this is about Calgarians. This is about ensuring that we can have housing that we can afford, that we can have jobs that we can count on, safe streets for our kids. Those are the issues central to Calgarians. And of course, the politicians are going to put forward their ideas, but I think we have to give something for Calgarians to vote for rather than just against.
All right, more at Jeromy.ca. That's Jeromy. Looking forward to the race and these conversations, and I'm sure we'll touch base again down the road. But thanks for making some time for us here today, Jeromy Farkas.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rob.
Okay, there you go. That is Jeromy Farkas. He is running for mayor in the city of Calgary 4 years after he did so in 2021, following a 4-year stint on Calgary City Council. So our thanks to Jeromy Farkas for joining us here today. Also, big thanks to Dr. Mark Tyndall. Again, his new book, it's called Vaping, Behind the Smoke and Fears. And our thanks to Dr. Michael Geist from the University of Ottawa, michaelgeist.ca, his latest on some of the lawful access provisions in Bill C2 and his concerns and much more as well, michaelgeist.ca. And again, thanks for joining us here, episode 7 of the Rob Breakenridge Show, you can go to our website or Substack page. It's robbreakenridge.ca. You can follow, subscribe there. You can also listen and subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, other podcast platforms. You can go to our Substack page and find the RSS link, the URL, and you can use that to listen on various platforms. You can also find the podcast and other interview content on our YouTube page, Rob Breakenridge Show. Again, thanks so much for joining us here. Episode 7 of the Rob Breakenridge Show. We'll be back later this week on Friday with episode number 8. In the meantime, take care. We'll talk to you then.